Next morning, Sam took Louis to school with him. Sam rode his pony and Louis flew along. At the schoolhouse, the other children were amazed to see this great bird with his long neck, bright eyes, and big feet. Sam introduced him to the teacher of the first grade, Mrs. Hammerbotham, who was short and chubby. Sam explained that Louis wanted to read and write because he was unable to make any sounds with his throat. Mrs. Hammerbotham stared at Louis. Then she shook her head. "No birds," she said. "I've got enough trouble." Sam looked disappointed. "Please, Mrs. Hammerbotham," he said, "please let him stand in your class and learn to read and write." "Why does a bird need to read and write?" replied the teacher. "Only people need to communicate with one another." "That's not quite true, Mrs. Hammerbotham," said Sam. "If you'll excuse me for saying so, I have watched birds and animals a great deal. All birds and animals talk to one another. They really have to in order to get along. Mothers have to talk to their young. Males have to talk to females, particularly in the spring of the year when they are in love." "In love?" said Mrs. Hammerbotham, who seemed to perk up at this suggestion. "What do you know about love?" Sam blushed. "What kind of bird is he?" she asked. "He's a young trumpeter swan," said Sam. "Right now he's sort of a dirty gray color, but in another year he'll be the most beautiful thing you ever saw. Pure white, with black bill and black feet. He was hatched last spring in Canada and now lives in the Red Rock Lakes. But he can't say "coho" the way the other swans can, and this puts him at a terrible disadvantage. "Why?" asked the teacher. "Because it does," said Sam. "If you wanted to say "coho" and couldn't make a single solitary sound, wouldn't you feel worried?" "I don't want to say "coho," replied the teacher. "I don't even know what it means. Anyway, this is all just foolishness, Sam. What makes you think a bird can learn to read and write? It's impossible." "Give him a chance," pleaded Sam. "He is well behaved and he's bright, and he's got this very serious speech defect." "What's his name?" "I don't know," replied Sam. "Well," said Mrs. Hammerbotham, "if he's coming into my class, he's got to have a name. Maybe we can find out what it is." She looked at the bird. "Is your name Joe?" Louis shook his head. "Jonathan?" Louis shook his head again. "Is your name Louis?" asked Mrs. Hammerbotham. Louis nodded his head very hard and jumped up and down and flapped his wings. "Great Caesar's ghost!" cried the teacher. "Look at those wings!" "Well, his name is Louis, that's for sure." "All right, Louis, you may join the class. Stand right here by the blackboard and don't mess up the room either. If you need to go outdoors for any reason, raise one wing." Louis nodded. The first graders cheered. They liked the looks of the new pupil and were eager to see what he could do. "Quiet, children," said Mrs. Hammerbotham sternly. "We'll start with the letter A." She picked up a piece of chalk and made a big A on the blackboard. "Now you try it, Louis." Louis grabbed a piece of chalk in his bill and drew a perfect A right under the one the teacher had drawn. "You see," said Sam, "he's an unusual bird." "Well," said Mrs. Hammerbotham, "A is easy. I'll give him something harder." She wrote C-A-T on the board. "Let's see you write cat, Louis." Louis wrote cat. "Well, cat is easy too," muttered the teacher. "Cat is easy because it's short." "Can anyone think of a word that is longer than cat?" "Catastrophe," said Charlie, who sat in the first row. "Good," said Mrs. Hammerbotham. "That's a good hard word. But does anyone know what it means? What is a catastrophe?" "An earthquake," said one of the girls. "Correct," replied the teacher. "What else?" "War is a catastrophe," said Charlie. Correct, replied Mrs. Hammerbotham. What else is? A very small, red-headed girl named Jenny raised her hand. Yes, Jenny, what is a catastrophe? In a very small, high voice, Jenny said, when you get ready to go on a picnic with your father and mother, and you make peanut butter sandwiches and jelly rolls, and put them in a thermos box with bananas and an apple and cookies and napkins and pop and hard-boiled eggs, and then you put the thermos box in your car, and just as you were starting out, it starts to rain, and your parents say there's no point in having a picnic in the rain. That is a catastrophe. Very good, Jenny, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. It isn't as bad as an earthquake or a war, but when a picnic gets canceled on account of rain, it is a catastrophe for a child, I guess. Anyway, catastrophe is a good word. No bird can write that word, I'll bet. If I can teach a bird to write the word catastrophe, it'll be a big news all over Sweetgrass County. I'll get my picture in Life magazine. I'll be famous. Thinking of all these things, she stepped up to the board and wrote C-A-T-A-S-T-R-O-P-H-E. Okay, Louis, let's see you write that. Louis picked up a fresh piece of chalk in his bill. He was scared. He took a good look at the word. A long word, he thought. It is really no harder than a short one. I'll just copy one letter at a time, and pretty soon it will be finished. Besides, my life is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe to be without a voice. Then he began writing. C-A-T-A-S-T-R-O-P-H-E. He wrote, making each letter very neatly. When he got to the last letter, the pupils clapped and stamped their feet and banged on their desk, and one boy quickly made a paper airplane and zoomed it into the air. Mrs. Hammerbotham rapped for order. Very good, Louis, she said. Sam, it's time you went to your own classroom. You shouldn't be in my room. Go on and join 5th grade. I'll take care of your friend the swan. Back in his own room, Sam sat down at his desk, feeling very happy about the way things had turned out. The 5th graders were having a lesson in arithmetic, and their teacher, Miss Annie Snug, greeted Sam with a question. Miss Snug was young and pretty. Sam, if a man can walk 3 miles in 1 hour, how many miles can he walk in 4 hours? It would depend on how tired he got after the first hour, replied Sam. The other pupils roared. Miss Snug rapped for order. Sam is quite right, she said. I never looked at the problem that way before. I always supposed that man could walk 12 miles in 4 hours, but Sam may be right. The man may not feel so spunky after the first hour. He may drag his feet. He may slow down. Albert raised his hand. My father knew a man who tried to walk 12 miles and he died of heart failure. Goodness, said the teacher. I suppose that could happen too. Anything can happen in 4 hours, said Sam. A man might develop a blister on his heel, or he might find some berries growing along the road and stop to pick them. That would slow him up, even if he wasn't tired or didn't have a blister. It would indeed, agreed the teacher. Well, children, I think we have all learned a great deal about arithmetic this morning, thanks to Sam Beaver. And now, here is a problem for one of the girls in the room. If you are feeding a baby from a bottle and you give the baby 8 ounces of milk in one feeding, how many ounces of milk would the baby drink in 2 feedings? Linda raised her hand. About 15 ounces, she said. Why is that? Asked Miss Snug. Why wouldn't the baby drink 16 ounces? Because he spills a little bit each time, said Linda. It runs out the corners of his mouth and gets on his mother's lap. By this time, the class was howling so loudly the arithmetic lesson had to be abandoned. But everyone had learned how careful you have to be when dealing with figures.